No, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. We had commissioners had a series of difficult meetings last night and this morning, which by and large were not successful. We have some things we're going to go through at the very front end, but then we will have some discussion of the items of which we cannot agree upon. So, Dr. Wilson, can we start with the season dates?
Good morning, Commissioners. You have on the screen and in front of you the season dates for the fishing period for 2018. The Conference Board recommended dates of the 10th of March to the 7th of November, noting a closing date no earlier than the 7th November was their preference. The Processor Advisory Board recommended an opening date of the 24th of March and a closing date of the 1st of November. And above that, you also see the underneath the Processor Advisory Board, the dates, proposed dates for the commercial fishery in Area 2A, the Derby.
So for 2A, is there a motion on 2A?
So, Mr. Chairman, I would move that.
Down there.
Oh, they're right in front of me. Okay. So I would move for Area 2A, the opening dates of the processors' recommendations of June 27th, July 11th, 25th of July, August 8th, August 22nd, the 5th of September, and 19th of September. And this is for Area 2A for their Derby fishery.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on this?
I have no discussion.
Is there any opposition to this motion? I see no opposition. The motion passes. We have adopted that for the 2A season. May I have a motion on the season dates for the other areas?
You want me to make a motion? Well, I would move that the opening date be March 24th and the closing date be the 7th of November, 2018.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Thank you. Is there any discussion on that?
I'll make a short comment. I would have supported the PAG or the Conference Board recommendation on this, but due to the fact that we are unable to come to a reconciliation on the harvest limits in order for the U.S. side to get regs in place, this delay will help that process. So that's why the date of 24th of March has been chosen by myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Elverson. Is there any other comment or discussion? Is there any opposition to the motion? I see no opposition, so that motion passes. And as Mr. Elverson says, we will discuss this a little bit more as we go through the remaining events.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the season dates you've approved for the quota fisheries, commercial fisheries in Area 2B and North are the 24th of March through the 7th of November. The 24th of March to the 7th of November also applies to all the other Area 2A fisheries, just to be clear. And the dates you see on the screen that you approved are the dates for the 2A non-treaty directed commercial fisheries. So those are the Derby dates. And the way that works is that the season will open, the first fishing period will take place on the 27th of June. If quota remains, it will be open for the 11th of July. And after that, as well, if quota remains, it'll be open for subsequent dates.
Thank you, Mr. Keith.
So next we move to the catch share plans.
Yes, please.
Coming up on your screen. So we will ask you to note the catch share plans in place for Area 2A, Areas 2C and 3A, and Areas 4C, D, and E. And then after that, we'll ask you to note the charter management measures proposed for the North Pacific Council for Areas 2C and 3A.
Yes, can we have a motion on these catch share plans, please?
Mr. Chairman, you want en bloc motion for all of them?
Yes, please.
Mr. Chairman, I would move the catch share plans as presented to the commission, as noted here, 1, 2, 3, and 4 for the Pacific Council, and as well as the North Pacific Council, and in the respective areas listed there on before us for 2A, 2C, 3A, and 4C, D, and E. There were slight changes from last year to this year in 2A. And I believe there are some recommended changes in 2C and 3A, depending on where the U.S. side eventually sets those harvest limits unilaterally. So,
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Is there any other discussion on this? I would guess I would note that this is kind of uncharted territory. This is a new territory for us because of our lack of agreement on catch quotas. And so it's more difficult to, as we have in the past, put up the numbers and the rules and the management measures as we have in the past. So we're struggling in front of you to get that done. So that's where we are. Is there any other comment on this? Is there any opposition to the motion? I see none, so those are noted and accepted. I'm sorry. I was under the impression that charter management measures were included in the motion.
Mr. Chairman, that was the intent, and I referenced that comment when I mentioned 2C and 3A.
Thank you. So we have agreed with that. So that brings us to the big issue, of course, which is catch quotas. And in the unusual circumstance where I believe, and many people can speak to this, but in the unusual circumstance where there was general agreement by the two parties that the stock is in some decline and there needs to be a reaction by the parties in reducing quotas to protect the stock, we were unable to agree on how those reductions should be shared through all of the management areas. Because of that, the Halibut Commission regulations that were adopted last year will remain in place until the domestic parties can change them through their own domestic processes. And we will work on that. And we intend in the U.S. to start a process that will set quotas as rapidly as we can to protect those stocks. So we will display here the numbers that we believe should be in place for 2018, area by area, shortly. But I would ask the other commissioners if they'd like to make some general statements before we get those numbers on the record. And perhaps we'll alternate. This will be my statement. I think it's unfortunate that we couldn't agree on the distribution of catches because we do generally agree on the status of the stock. I will ask Mr. Ryall to make a statement, and then perhaps we can have Mr. Alverson make a statement, et cetera. So Mr. Ryall, would you care to just comment on this?
Yes, thanks, Commissioner Balsiger. I was actually thinking of holding my statement until we actually had the catch numbers up, and so I will just make a short statement now, and a much lengthier one after the catch numbers are up. And because I think my statements, people in the audience need to hear and see what the numbers are, and then my statements will have more meaning, I think. But I will say this at this point, that we as Canada are very troubled that we could not come to an agreement given the state of the science advice that we have seen over the last week. And I think there's a lot of hard work ahead of us to resolve this impasse and come to agreement as we in Canada and the U.S. have in the past. And I look forward to trying to resolve this sooner than later so that we're not in this position again.
Thank you, Mr. Ryall. Commissioner Alverson, would you care to make a comment?
I think the U.S. commissioners will make further comment once the numbers are up. I'm mindful of a monument between Canada and the United States as we enter Canada. It says, brothers and sisters of a common mother. And I would hope that brothers and sisters would be able to come to a resolution on this resource that both countries have spearheaded since 1924, the first concept of sustainability for a natural resource shared by two great nations. And I would hope that we would be able to come to some resolution and understanding of what these shared responsibilities on conservation are sooner than later, just as Paul has articulated. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Alverson. Mr. Vanderhyde, would you care to comment?
No, Chair, no, thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bacon?
Mr. Chairman, I'm prepared to speak to catch limits when you're ready to take comments on the catch limits more specifically.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner? Tim?
Mr. Chair, no, not at this time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So perhaps, let's see, perhaps we will put up the U.S. catch limits that we intend to put in place. If that's all right, we will do that first. So Ms. Banking, can you lead us through that?
Mr. Chairman, I think what I would, how I'd like to approach it, if I could, would be to suggest the catch limits that the U.S. will manage to in Alaska, and then I'll allow Mr. Alverson to address the catch limits for Area 2A.
Thank you.
That's acceptable. So in speaking to this, I guess I would, in general, say that we all do share a concern about the status of the stocks. The indices for the overall stock show a decrease in weight per unit effort of 10%, which may not sound that alarming on its own, but a 24% decrease in the numbers per unit effort, with particularly notable declines in Area 2B and 3B. We're concerned about the spawning biomass, we're concerned about recruits, but I think we're particularly concerned that we're not seeing year classes coming in to replace the fish that we're fishing on now. So the U.S., following the lead of the PAG and the Conference Board, has elected to set catch limits across Alaska at half down from last year's adopted catch limits to the 2018 reference 46 catch limits. I can read those off from what I have here. Those are for 2C, 6.34, for 3A, 12.54, for 3B, 3.27, for 4A, 1.74, for 4B, 1.28, and for 4C, D&E, 3.62. And our understanding is that if 2B through 4C, D&E went halfway down, as we've suggested, a consistent policy across these areas, that we would remain under 36 million, which was our target to remain under for this year. We think it's really important at this time to recognize the science. I think there is no better stock assessment team in the world than the U.S. has to put our confidence in their lead in giving us feedback on this stock and giving us their best assessment of what we need to do to take care of this stock. We've elected to take this policy of half down. We'd hoped that Canada would follow that policy. I'll let them speak to that. But we believe that it's 1 year's data. We'll get another year's data next year to be able to verify. But there's a number of other data points out there that corroborate what the surveys are showing us from this year. Those are the Gulf trawl surveys, which show significant declines in small halibut, as well as the Bering Sea trawl surveys showing significant declines in small halibut. The recruitment strengths that we've had presented to us by our staff showing weaker year classes out beyond the 2005 year classes, and that's what we'll be fishing on in coming years. So we're stair-stepping down. We're easing into the decline. I think we are putting the industry on notice that we expect the need for more reductions in the future, and that we're doing this because we need to conserve the stock, take care of our spawning biomass, make sure we have healthy stocks for the future. And again, I guess I go back to the indices that been presented to us with weight per unit effort, numbers per unit effort from our surveys, to commercial catch rates, where in areas that had fairly consistent increases, we're starting to see leveling off and even declines. And I would say real cause for concern across all areas. We believe that in doing this, the U.S. is being conservative, is being responsible, and is also being responsive to the industry in doing this in a two-step process. And I'll conclude my comments there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Benken. And Mr. Alverson for 2A, please.
So, Mr. Chairman, the recommendation of the U.S. Side would have been for a TCEY and 2A of 1.32 million pounds for 2018. For those that are, it doesn't show up there, but this would have resulted in a FCEY of 1.17 million pounds compared to the 133 last year.
Excuse me, you typed in 1.43, and I don't believe that was the numbers you said.
No. So this is TCEY, right? Correct.
Yes.
So it'd be 1.32.
Thank you.
Yep, that's it. We have a very unique relationship with the 2A tribal nations that we met with. We're honored to represent them and meet with them the other afternoon. We have unique and very tightly managed co-managers with the state of Washington, Oregon, California, and of course the tribes in accounting for the resource that we harvest in this area. It's California and Washington and Oregon have significant teams that they put out during their openings to account for this, their catches. And their trawl bycatch issue is significantly under control, and in fact continuing to decline with the incentivization of their trawl ITQ program. And we heard comments from Mr. Phil Anderson on some unique ways that is being fulfilled. For myself, I look at what happened this year with our survey. I think our survey, I was very happy with I think they call it a densified survey in the north and our general survey. However, it was in part complicated with hypoxia situation where at least 19 stations were compromised to some extent, and it produced what it produced. It produced zeros. And which makes me feel like we need to step back, and I go back to 2016. We used the 2016 information to justify a 1.33 FCEY that year. And we expanded our surveys, and the results are what they are. They came in significantly reduced, and so I felt the way I came up with the 1.77 recommendation to my fellow U.S. commissioners is that in 2016 we were at 1.14, which was the highest level in several decades of harvesting, and the 1.77 I think provides some additional fishing opportunities, which we are significantly looking at in this area, but also recognizes that there's a coast-wide problem in numbers of juvenile halibut. There's a coast-wide overall down of 10% in the weight per unit of efforts. So it tries to balance a number of issues in 2A, and those are my comments, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And I think the audience can see the very second to the bottom line is what the FCEY would be based on those TCEYs that have been suggested here by Ms. Elverson and Ms. Bankin and Mr. Elverson. Yeah. So Canada for 2B.
Yes, thanks very much. Canada is recommending or proposing, I should say, that we will be managing to 7.1 million TCEY in 2018. We, as collectively, before getting into 2B in particular, but collectively, we have agreed to take a first step in reducing total TCEY in 2018. Canada has reduced from 40.7, excuse me, last year, the total was 40.75 million pounds. Canada's portion of that last year was 8.3 million pounds. We are reducing to 7.1 million pounds, or basically a 1.2 million pound reduction. This reduction amounts to about a 15% reduction in overall TCEY for 2017. I think one of the biggest challenges that we face is that Canada has said consistently ever since apportionment came into being that we disagree with that use of a way for allocating the resource. So for terming this half down is based upon apportionment. And if you don't, and as I said, we do not agree with apportionment, but if you look at what last year's shares were for each one of the parties, Canada's reduction of 15% is the second highest. The only other area that is taking a higher reduction than Canada is Area 3B, which is 17.8%. All other regulatory areas in the U.S. Vary from a low of 3.2, which is Area 3A, and up to, excuse me, no, 3A. And then 2A has a 10% reduction. My point overall in this is that we are responsible within Canada, and my view is that the U.S. is not in a number of their regulatory areas with a small change that they are taking in a number of their regulatory areas of 3%, 4%, 5%. I am troubled by this because I think the science is clear that we do have a situation in hand where we are seeing a multiple numbers of year classes that are going to not have recruits coming into the fishery, and this will impact us all collectively. The total TCEY adds up to, at least the number I have, I can't see it on the screen there, but I think what I have is 37 million 210,000. This, to me, is not enough of a reduction. We should be doing more. We should be doing it at least down to 35 to 36 million. Canada offered to do other things, but that was not successful. We think that we are going to be back here next year in 2019, being likely required to do additional steps. We will certainly work with the U.S. to make that happen. As Commissioner Albertson said, we have a long history of working together, and I'm sure that that will happen and that we will resolve this. But I do think the bottom line is that we are faced with an issue of some lack of recruitments that are going to impact us for a period of time. We should have done more. We will want to do more, and we will be facing it again a year from now. It cannot all be solved by one regulatory area. With Canada's reduction of 1.2 million, we are not the only source of this issue. I pointed out yesterday that since 2006, total removals in Region 2 have declined by 46%, while Region 3 removals have declined by 62%. So both regions have taken significant reductions, but each of those areas have responded differently. So despite those notable reductions in Region 3 removals, the Secretariat estimates that the coastwide proportions of biomass in Region 3 has continued to decrease by 18%. In contrast, Region 2's portions of biomass have increased by 15% at the same time period. So while Region 2 goes up, we are still taking the second largest reduction. This, to me, is not how we're going to solve the problem. So I do think we have more work to do in front of us. We are committed to working together to solve this, but it won't be resolved by going back to the same old discussion around apportionment. We need to come up with a new way of solving it, and we have a proposal of how we're going to do that, and we'll be speaking to that shortly.
Thank you, Mr. Ryall. Ms. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'd like to respond to that, I guess, just briefly. So I certainly, as someone who fishes in 2C, works with 2C fishermen, understand Canada's frustration with the zero-sum game that's associated with apportionment. Nevertheless, that's the science that we're using right now. Nevertheless, I also think it's really important that the harvest that we take out of each of these areas is roughly proportional to the distribution of stock that's in that area. And in looking at the tables that were sent out after the interim meeting, right now, roughly 11.3% of the spawning biomass is estimated to be in Area 2B. And yet Canada's looking for a catch limit that's closer to 20% or over 20%. I have a problem with that. I have a problem with that in terms of conservation of the resource, conservation of the spawning biomass, and equity in sharing in the conservation burden of taking care of this resource for the long term. And in speaking to the magnitude of the declines, the magnitude of the reductions across area, I would also add that over the last decade, since we've gone to this coastwide apportionment, the U.S. in Alaska has come in very close to the reference levels over time. We've seen Canada come in 11 million over those reference levels since 2010. In fact, last year, the U.S. set catch limits west of Area 2 below the reference level of the F46. Had we not done that, the reductions that the areas in Alaska were having to take at this point would be larger in magnitude than what you're seeing here. So it's all where you start is what determines how big the reduction is at this point. And in my view, Alaska has been very conservative. The cuts are a little bit less painful this year because last year we kept those allocations down. I believe we're taking a very measured approach in Alaska to addressing a conservation issue and doing it in a way that's responsive to the industry and responsive to the resource. And I regret that we aren't applying a consistent policy coastwide across all areas.
Thank you, Ms. Benkin. Any other comments on this catch tables? Mr. Ryall.
Yeah, I don't want to belabor the point, but apportionment is not science, is the way Commissioner Benkin cast it. It is a way of trying to come up with an allocative method that has a very good, I suppose, algorithm, but it is not science, and an allocation takes into account more than science. It takes into social and economic considerations. And that has been the fundamental piece of disagreement, as I said earlier, between Canada and the U.S. on the view of apportionment. I won't belabor it anymore, Commissioner Benkin, but that has really been our fundamental disagreement ever since apportionment came into being.
Thank you, Mr. Ryall. Any further comments on the catch tables?
I'm sorry, but
Ms. Benkin.
I am going to belabor it, sorry. I promise to stop after this, but I guess just to say, I understand apportionment involves other factors. We've tried to make apportionment as biologically based as it can be, and I think that's our goal going forward. But when I talk about harvest proportional to the distribution of fish in the area, that's not apportionment, that's coming from the survey. And I don't think anybody would argue that our survey isn't science. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Final comments? I will reiterate what I said at the first. I think it's not a good situation when both parties generally agree on the decline of the stock that we are charged to maintain in a sustainable manner. We both agree that there needs to be reductions, and I consider it a personal failure that we're unable to get together and set quotas that would reflect that concern over the stock. That's my fault, and I hope we can get past that. Dr. Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. Noting these proposed catch limits for each of the contracting parties, I would ask that the harvest decision table be brought up and indicate where we would sit if these modified catch limits were to be implemented domestically. So if we could project that on the screen, please. So highlighted is the status quo from 2017 rolling over to 2018, which would be the default. And I guess we should probably focus more so on the suggested national catch limits that are going to be attempted to be implemented. And you can see there in the blue text where it says suggested, the 37.2 TCEY value. And so, Chair, I would simply draw the Commission's attention to the relative risk of further stock decline at those levels of harvest in 2018. In terms of the stock trend, the spawning biomass with the 37.2 TCEY, the science is predicting there is a 93% chance of decline of less than 5% from in 2018. That number declines for a couple more years out, but in terms of the stock status, the spawning biomass itself, it's a much lower risk of decline. The stock is currently at around 40% virgin biomass, but it's prudent to point out that the Commission, through national implementation of those catch limits, is adopting a fish down strategy. And I'll leave it at that, Chair, and for further Commissioner comment.
Thank you very much. Are there Commissioner comments on that? I see no comments. I guess it speaks for itself. So are there any other items that the Commission would like to bring up at this time? Commissioner Ryall.
Yes, are we moving off this topic?
Unless there are comments or more discussion, I think we have identified those quotas, those limits that we will attempt to put in place through a much more cumbersome, in the United States, domestic process. The international quotas, as you know, have always been able to be put in place by early March. I don't know what we can accomplish, but I think that's the bottom line. We are going to try to get those quotas in place as rapidly as we can, and we're even now working on ways to expedite that, but it will be less efficient. I have no other comments on that, but I'm pleased to take some from you if you do.
No, I was going to propose something to the commission about how we can deal with moving off using a flawed method of allocation known as apportionment. So allocation is a process for determining allowable catch within each regulatory area. Allocation has an important social economic consequence, and there should reflect the party's objective for sharing the resource. Selection of an allocation approach is a bilateral policy discussion that must be led by Canadian and U.S. commissioners. It will be informed by science, and it should not be determined solely by science activities. We think that some of the work that the MSAB could undertake would help inform how the commissioners can make some decisions on sharing the resource. So noting the Commission's request at the 2017 annual meeting to develop alternative biologically based stock distribution strategies for consideration by the Commission, we think these should be incorporated into the MSC program of work, and noting the Secretariat's subsequent analysis that the regulatory areas are management areas and do not necessarily have biological basis. And this is reference from IPHC document 2017, MSAB 09-09. And that alternative strategies for distributing TCY, both broader biologically based regions, would not force arbitrary delineation among areas with evidence of strong stock mixing. And noting that, just one sec. And noting that Canada has identified a number of reasons that it has never accepted the coast-wide stock distribution modeling methodology as a biologically defensible or acceptable method for defining regulatory allocations. And that apportionment values have never served as the adopted catch limit in 2B and almost never in 2A, due to in large part to the lack of support from Canada and some US constituents. It is recommended that the use of current stock distribution modeling methodology, also known as apportionment, for generating advice on regulatory area catch limits be discontinued. It is agreed that the MSC program of work delivered recommendations on alternate stock distribution strategies by the 2021 annual meeting, if not sooner. It is recommended that as an interim measure, reference catch limits for regulatory areas be based on proportions derived from the FCEY values that the Commission has negotiated and agreed to in recent years. It is proposed to use 2013 through 2017 period as the basis for determining interim portions. This period is the most recent reflection of fishery dynamics and also is the point which catch sharing plans in Alaska were established, meaning that is what is included in FCEY as agreed during that period is stable. The suite of objectives under consideration for the MSC process cover conservation and social and economic interest. As such, the time period over which performance measures are calculated varies depending on the nature of objective. Specifically, conservation interest may be mid to long term. This is actually separate, but I might as well put it all on the table at this point. Conservation interests may be mid to long term in relation to species life history, and economic history. Economic interests may have short term, even immediate and mid-term time horizons related to business planning cycles. This difference in time periods sets up a conflict between A, the necessary constraints of industry stakeholders who have to plan a business and allocate capital, B, the goals of environmental groups or policy goals of managing agencies that have no such constraints. Therefore, it is recommended that long-term and short-term performance metrics are evaluated in the MSE process, as we have discussed this week. Next, on size limit, noting report IPHC 2018, AM094-14, the performance of the management procedure is dominated by management decisions other than the size limit. For example, removal of the size limit is likely to result in minimal changes to yield, is what has been presented by Dr. Stewart. It is therefore recommended that the size limit remain unchanged. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ryall. Any comments? Ms. Bengen?
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, Commissioner Ryall, I was not always clear where you were reading from MSAB, and I did not get the report pulled up and find your place in time. And so where you were reading from that and where you were suggesting a different course of action, I think I understand you to be looking for a way to expedite distribution, which now it sounds like we're calling allocation, or back to calling allocation process. But it wasn't clear to me where you were assigning that work to be done. And I'm sorry if I just missed it.
I think that work can be informed by the MSAB process, but MSAB is only one place, and then it'll be up to the commissioners to decide on the overall policy.
Thank you, Mr. Ryall. I'm not certain I followed all through that. It would be helpful if we could see your written proposal. I didn't hear you make a motion, but perhaps I just missed that.
Well, there were actually 3 items wrapped up in there. The first one is dealing with trying to provide some resolution to how the commission develops allocation and provide a replacement to apportionment. And so it's not, I'm making a motion that we collectively begin to undertake that work. And so I said, it's recommended that an interim measure reference levels, and I won't go on, but we can provide you this document so that you can have a chance to review it, and we can put it up on the screen as well. And then the second one was dealing with MSE timeframes. We've dealt with that a little bit here at this current meeting. And I think there's agreement that we would like to have both mid and long-term performance metrics created out of that MSE process. And the third was just to put, I suppose, a bow on it around size limit, and that the size limit remains unchanged, which is what we've heard at this meeting.
Thank you. So the third one I can deal with, understand personally. Yes, we've agreed not to change the size limit, I think, at this meeting. On the very first item, you know, as a participant at the North Pacific Fishery Management Council through many rationalization processes, assigning catch rights to a myriad of sectors and individuals is the hard part. There's always multiple ways to look at it. So you suggest that in the interim, which may be years or a year or 2 years or 3 or 4 years, that we would use a historic distribution as realized it from 2013 to 2017. Well, I certainly can't agree to that sitting here without seeing what that does relative to looking at from 2010 to 2015, those kinds of things. So I don't know why you chose those years. And so if you're asking us to agree to use that as an interim distribution without any analysis, I would not find that acceptable. But maybe I still missed the point of your proposal. So could you address that, please?
Yeah, certainly, Jim. I think, I mean, I understand that you would need to reflect upon this, but I think since this issue has been faced by the commission ever since I think apportionment has come into being, it's time to deal with it in an open forum and move forward. First off, recommending that the use of the current stock distribution modeling methodology known as apportionment be discontinued. And that I think we agree that the MSC program of work to deliver recommendations and alternate stock distribution strategies by 2021 is what we agreed to in the work plan. And that will help inform a longer term process for allocation. Does that make sense? And then that's one item.
I guess, so focusing on that one item, I am uncertain how you think we are going to accomplish that yet. Are you talking about reaching that decision at this table to discontinue use of our set line survey for distribution? You want to make that motion and accomplish that here? Are you suggesting that might be one thing we'd look at as we go forward trying to solve the allocation problem?
I am proposing that we discontinue it and that we replace it by an interim measure, as I was speaking, using reference catch limits from regulatory areas. And I was proposing that we use 2013 through 2017 period as the basis for determining those interim proportions.
Ms. Bacon.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I can't support this motion as it's been explained. What I could support was a request or direction from this commission to the MSAB to prioritize over this next year work on a new distribution process, and that recognizing, of course, whatever the MSAB comes up with is going to come before this body, and then it is ultimately a decision that the commission makes, but that we ask them, direct them to take into consideration what you've put in front of us today, which would be looking at these looking at these years, but I would certainly not limit them to looking at these years, 2013 to 2017. I think they should also look at a longer time frame as well as the short-term time frame. I would support them looking at mid and long-term performance metrics as you suggested, and also holding the size limit the same. But I can't support it as us right now taking this action. I could support us directing or requesting the MSAB prioritize this work and report back to us with their results.
Thank you, Ms. Bacon. Mr. Ryall.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Benkin. So I'm hearing support for the second and third proposals. First off, on the MSC timeframes of producing mid and long-term performance metrics. And so I'm here, thank you for supporting that. And second, I'm hearing support for the size limit remaining the same. So, and then we can come back to the first one, dealing with apportionment and allocation. So do we need to make a motion on that, Mr. Chairman?
If I would like to see individual motions on those, and I also will not support a motion that suggests that we have the information in front of us to choose an interim series of years as the basis for distribution. I think it would be not exercising due responsibility to adopt that without even having any numbers in front of us to say what that does. It's just too vulnerable to quick mistakes if we try to make a major decision like that here. So if you're making a motion on the first one, I'm not going to support it, but if you would make motions, we could discover whether I'm a lone voice on that.
Well, maybe let's deal with the first one that I think is the simplest on MSE timeframes. Recommending that long-term and short-term performance metrics are evaluated in the MSE process.
That was the motion. Is there a second? Moved and seconded. Would you care to speak to it more than you have?
No.
Any other comments on it? I see no comments. Is there opposition?
Wait, can I ask a clarification?
Ms. Benkin.
So if I could just clarify, so you're asking that the MSC and look at mid and long-term performance metrics, and I assume that means we're involving the MSAB in that process?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. And my comment is I think this is not remarkably different than came out of our discussions yesterday, but perhaps clarifies it. So I think that is a good motion. Is there any opposition to this motion? If not, that motion passes. Mr. Ryall, you had another motion.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Balsiger. The second motion is recommending that the size limit remain unchanged.
Is there a second?
I could second, but I'd like to ask a question.
Yep.
My understanding is that your intent is to hold the size limit the same through this modeling process for the foreseeable future. I'm just not sure. Are you saying hold the size limit the same for the modeling process, leave it unchanged for?
I'm saying for management purposes that it would remain unchanged. If there is well, given what we've seen so far, I don't see the value of spending more effort on looking at size limits.
I would agree with you on that. I mean, I think their situations could change where it would be revisited, but for now I would agree. So I would second.
Thank you. And of course, I think we all recognize that we are not tying the hands of future commissions as we make these motions. So is there any other discussion on this? Is there opposition to the motion? I see none, so we will adopt a motion that says we will maintain the 32-inch minimum size limit, the size limits we have now. Mr. Ryall, did you have more?
One last one. Thank you very much. Given the discussion that's happened on the first one already, dealing with how to come up with some interim measure, while the MSEB works, I would say, on a longer term process to try to provide guidance scientifically around stock distribution that could guide decisions on allocation, which, as I was proposing, would be received no later than 2021 annual meeting. And that's what we've heard over this week, given the work plan that we agreed to, and with the added resources of a programmer, and I think it's I forget the title, is an MSE expert, but MSE researcher. We've added some additional resources to make that happen sooner so that we can get the answers by 2021. What the second part of this is to provide some interim measures so that we don't have the continual discussion and friction that I think really has happened, increased each annual meeting that I have attended around apportionment and allocation. And I recognize, Chairman Balsiger, that given what I've just provided to you, it's not fair to ask you to provide a time frame at this meeting, but maybe I'd amend the motion to say that we as Canada would like to make progress on this and then recommend that we as commissioners have time to get together via teleconference sometime in, I'll propose February, once you've had some time among yourselves to discuss this, once you actually see a hard copy and have a chance to reflect and think, maybe you have some other ideas, that we then consider this motion, and you may at this point have some others that you'd like to bring forward. But I think I would like to see this happen sooner than later and not wait until the interim meeting. And otherwise, I feel that we could be in the same position from a year from now and having the same impasse, which I think we collectively do not want to do.
Thank you. Comments?
Could I second, but then ask a
Yes,
question?
Yes, thank you
for
for seconding
clarification?
that. And then this question.
Yeah, so I have a few questions for clarification. So I understood in your first motion, it included years and it also included us rejecting at this time the SBR reference level as they've been using it of F46 and distributed across areas as they've been doing. And I'm not ready to support that, but I understand that's not part of this motion, that this motion just commits us, and I assume working with the MSAB again, to reaching a new distribution to allocation strategy by 2021, and also commits commissioners to participating in meetings between now and the interim meeting as needed to accomplish that goal. Is that correct?
Yes, basically that is correct.
Any other comments? So it may end up that the best possible allocation tool is the set line survey. So it may not, but I think we have to include that in the mix. So I just want to be clear that this motion does not throw that out today as a possibility that should be included in the analysis that goes forward.
That's fine, Commissioner Balsiger. I think that what we're agreeing to now is to consider what Canada is proposing and get together sometime sooner than later. And I was proposing February by teleconference. It could be in person, whatever we need to work on, so that we collectively accelerate and coming up with an interim measure to remove future impediments to coming to a common agreement.
Thank you very much. I think that's well said, and I applaud that approach. I'm willing to meet as often and as near term as we can, in person perhaps, but certainly on telephone. And of course, our commissioners are all busy people. Some of them make their life actually fishing. So as we will perhaps be able to prevail upon the Secretariat to help us schedule those meetings, but I'm in favor of that. Ms. Bacon.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to offer, I don't know whether it's an amendment or a clarification to that, but that we set that meeting after the MSAB is met, and that this motion includes a request of the MSAB to prioritize their work in February to provide their advice back to us on this action. And I'll make that as an amendment if maybe friendly, maybe not.
Is that a friendly amendment? Mr. Ryall, please.
I would be concerned about having the MSA shift their priorities different than what's in the current work plan. And we have an issue around dealing with our harvest control rule. And I think that should be the priority, so that we're also having clarity around SPR 46 or whatever that number might be. Could be higher, could be lower, depending on the work that the MSAB does. And I think we collectively as commissioners need to provide guidance to the MSAB if we're going to shift priority. And I think we need to have that discussion before we ask the MSAB to do more work on this.
Ms. Bacon.
Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to have that discussion with the MSAB, but I am not in support of us tackling this issue without more input from that group. We convened that group for the purpose of addressing both scale and distribution. They have been working hard for a number of years to develop the base to give us that kind of input, and I think to circumvent the people who have put that time in at this point would be inappropriate.
Other comments?
So,
For Mr. Alverson.
Paul, the proposed amendment from Linda was not acceptable. There was a discussion, but I didn't hear whether or not you went back to her suggestion.
Yes, thanks, Bob. I guess I think I would ask what Linda is seeking from the MSAB at this point. That would help the commissioners make an informed guidance back to the MSAB. I'm not sure what she is asking and when saying having the MSAB involved.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I could, what we had asked was the MSAB to help develop the ideas for alternative biological distribution of the stock, and whether that distribution should include, in addition to the survey, historic distribution of the stock or allocations, whether it should include catch weight per unit effort, what else they wanted considered. And I believe there's people who have been working on that, and that if they dedicated part of this next meeting to bringing those ideas forward, that they would have some suggestions for the commissioners. And I don't expect that they'll complete that work or that we'll complete that work in just a meeting, but to get some preliminary ideas from them on what we might want to pursue for an interim management distribution strategy to help guide our discussions. I don't want to not have that expertise, I guess, provided to us after that's a big part of what we've formed them around, formed that group around.
And I recall that I haven't been to the MSAB process for a year or two, but I recall there's some 20 or 30 people representing all parts of the Halibut user groups. I think that if the commissioners met absent that information and assuming we know what all of the users want, seems to be a little bit of a stretch. We perhaps could learn that, but I think Ms. Benkin may be right that we should use that collective experience at that body and the work that they've already done on that.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Alverson.
Commissioner Ryall, I would ask that you consider Linda's amendment, and I'm okay with it because we are not bound by the MSAB final decisions or the recommendations to us. They are recommendations to us, and there may be something there that we might actually be able to grab onto, or a couple of. So that's my thoughts.
Mr. Ryall.
Maybe a bit of amendment to Commissioner Benkin's amendment. How about that the commissioners meet by teleconference to agree upon what we are asking the MSAB to do on this particular item, and that if there was MSAB representatives, if we think they're required, I would be agreeable to that as well. That would help inform what they could do to help provide some guidance on an interim process. But the second question I would ask those MSAB representatives is what would that do to their current work plan? And that way, I think rather than going back and forth here at this point in time, we would be more informed collectively of what could be done on an interim basis and what guidance the MSAB could provide.
Ms. Benkin.
So I'm not sure I understood that. So your suggestion is that we have a teleconference to clarify what we're asking the MSAB to do. I feel like we have asked them to come up with possibilities for alternative management, or alternative biological distribution strategies already, and I know people have been working on that, and that what I would be asking them to do is get together, put their best ideas on the table, hopefully share them out ahead of time, narrow them down, and give us some as a starting point.
Mr. Ryall.
They are working on a long-term plan that we won't see until 2021. And what I'm proposing is that we get together to deal with something for the next 3 years, which would be 2019, 20, and 2021, because I suspect whatever we see that comes forward from the MSAB in 2021 would not be ready for implementation until 2022. And so I guess the difference, Commissioner Benken, is that in the interim, we're proposing that we should seek some guidance from the MSAB about what could be done in the interim and how that would affect their long-term plan, which is the 2021. And so otherwise, I suspect over the next 3 years, we will be going back around the same discussion that we've had for now a decade.
Ms. Bacon?
Okay, well, I'm sorry. I feel like we're spending way too much time on this. I'm happy to have a teleconference to talk about what we might ask of the MSAB to provide interim guidance to us. It's just very important to me that the MSAB is very involved in the process of both long-term distribution strategies as well as interim distribution strategies. And if you think it's helpful for us to talk ahead of asking for their help, then let's talk prior to their MSAB meeting and ask them at their MSAB meeting then to work on this and provide some guidance back to us. I just think it's essential that they're part of this process.
Thank you, Ms. Bacon. So, Mr. Ryall, is that getting close to what you could support?
Yes, it is.
So to clarify this, I would like to see one solution would be to withdraw the previous motion's amendment and start out with a new motion that to that end. So if you're inclined, you could withdraw your motion.
Yes, I am.
And the second? Yes. So the motion has been withdrawn. So if you could, please restate it along these lines of where we've reached.
Thank you. The motion would be to meet as early as we can. I was proposing February, and that meeting would be all 6 commissioners, along with the chairs, co-chairs of the MSAB and other technical people that as needed to help provide guidance to the commissioners on what could be done to support commissioners implementing some interim measures while a long-term measure is being developed by the MSAB for presentation in 2021.
Thank you for the motion. Is there a second?
Mr. Chairman, well, second, but I did not hear in there a commitment to involving the MSAB in developing the interim distribution measures as well, which is what my amendment started. So I just want to make sure that that's included in this restatement of the motion.
Mr. Ryall.
I'm sure that the MSAB will tell us, those representatives will tell us how the MSAB as a collectively can help inform this process for the interim.
Without understanding, Ms.
So
Bacon?
I'm in agreement, but the question I was asking Commissioner Benken is, well, to the MSAB is what would that do to their long-term plan? But I'm sure that they'll be able to tell us that. And I recognize what you're saying is that you want to make sure that they're involved, and I support that.
Okay.
Ms. Bacon?
Then I will be in support of this motion, and I will be looking to actively engage in this process and also to actively engage the people who have been working on this and helping us develop both an interim and a long-term management strategy that includes scale and distribution of catch.
Thank you for that. Any other comments on this motion? Is there any opposition to the motion? I see none, so the motion passes. So we have set up a near-term phone call that will advance this topic. Is there other commission business? Mr. Albertson.
Mr. Chair, as we get close to closing this out, this 93rd session, I'm 94. Okay. It'd been easier if it was 93rd, maybe. I'm really concerned about not being able to come to resolution on these harvest limits, and should the chair and the co-chair think after a week or after a weekend that there should be some intercessional discussion between the commissioners on the harvest limits, or if we are told from on high to do so, I'll make myself available to participate.
Thank you for that comment. We do have some other business items, if there's, which includes the election of, is it time to elect a chair? Which includes the election of a chairman of the IPHC. For that, is there a motion for the chair for IPHC for the next term? Yes. Please, Mr. Asu.
At this time, I'd like to nominate Paul Ryall as the chair of the next meeting.
I'll second that.
Moved and seconded. Is there any comments? I'd make a comment. We've had a number of difficult meetings. This has been the toughest one for me, but Mr. Ryall is a gentleman and has been in every negotiation and discussion we've had, so I'll be very pleased to support his nomination for chair. Any other comments? If not, is there any opposition to the motion? We have nominated and approved, we have moved, I guess, so we've accepted Mr. Ryall as our chairman as this meeting ends. Thank you. Motion for vice chair, please.
Mr. Chairman, I would nominate Dr. Balsiger as vice chair.
Thank you. Is there a second? Thank you for the second. Is there any opposition to me being vice chair for the next session? Thank you very much. So I proudly accept that role. Dr. Wilson, what else do we have? Yeah, so we are going to have a public comment. Perhaps it should have been before we elected officers. Mr. Alverson volunteered that he would be available for intercessional meetings, and I don't know if we need to take any action on that, but I appreciate it. So unless you think something other step is necessary, that's great. So let's have public comment and see what the public has to say about what we've done. Mr. Keith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have, so far I have 3 commenters from the room and 1 online, and make that 4 in the room. And starting with Bruce Gabris.
Apparently not.
Microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For this, I'll be very brief. I'm Bruce Gabris. I'm a U.S. harvester. The results of this meeting should not be a surprise to anyone here. Due to some fundamental disagreements between the parties, this result was almost inevitable. The current stock assessment was just the catalyst. Dr. Balsiger, I do not consider this meeting a result of failure. Principled people will sometimes disagree. The U.S. and Canada are good friends and neighbors. We share the longest undefended border in the world. I do not see our relations changing irrespective of what path the IPHC takes as we move forward. And I would like to thank all of the commissioners for their efforts on behalf of all of us and also on behalf of the resource. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gabris. Mr. Keith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Next up is, is Tom Marking.
Tom Marking, I'm a recreational fisherman from 2A down in California. I also serve as a recreational member of the MSAB. I guess I'm a little stunned by this process right now, and I'm kind of disappointed, but I understand the difficulty. You know, we're all fishermen, like we're all conservationists at heart. We all know we have to cut back. We're just trying to figure how and where to cut back. There's obviously some fundamental disagreements, but I would really encourage you, we need to get this SPR back to about 45 or higher. We do not dare let people go this year and fish at 38 SPR. We are going to push this population right to the edge. The whole point of the MSE process is that we build some buffer and we build some robust management procedures that we don't drive ourselves into high volatility. This is exactly what this is going to do. This is exactly the opposite of where we're trying to go. And I would really beseech you guys to work out some method. We can get that SPR back to about 45 or higher. We need to head that direction. This is really dangerous what we're doing right now. And it needs to be done a lot sooner, not next year, not 2 years. It needs to be done now. And I know this is tough and we're all going to have to tighten our belts and take a cut, but we better act now or we're really going to we're going to regret another year or two if we don't act now. So, but you're in a really tough situation. And I would hope that, you know, calmer heads would prevail and we could actually, you know, sit down out of the room with people and work this out and come back with a workable solution. But it's time for compromise and solutions. It's, you know, we can't keep on this thing where we're stalemated. You know, we can't keep fishing at this intensity level. So anyway, thank you. But I appreciate what you've done. This has to be resolved.
Thank you for the comment, Mr. Keith.
Our next speaker is Peggy Parker.
Good morning. Thank you, commissioners. And we understand, we're with you on the frustration that you must be all feeling. So thank you for your hard work. It's my understanding that the U.S. commissioners are going to have their terms end on March 31st. And given the developments of this week and setting meetings for them in the future beyond March 31st, I'd like to request that the U.S. delegation request to the Department of Commerce, the Department of State, the White House, that these terms are extended until the new appointments or the reappointments are done for the new commissioners or reappointed commissioners, which I understand is to take place this spring and summer. The MSAB will be meeting in May. The commissioners would be welcome to be there during that 4-day meeting. There are other reasons to have these commissioners be active until their reappointments are made or until the new appointments are in effect. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Parker. That reminds me of a requirement that I have failed to fulfill, but we'll finish the public comment and I will do that. Mr. Keith?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our next speaker is Heather McCarty.
Mr. Chairman, I'm Heather McCarty, and I'm from Alaska, and I'm speaking on my own behalf. I'd like to thank the Secretariat for the work that they've done. I think we can be proud of it. And I would also like to thank the U.S. Commissioners for, in my opinion, responding in an appropriate way to the science and for taking a step down to where we probably need to be. And for also being responsive to the needs of the fishermen and the communities that they are responsible for. I would suggest that, I know that there's an IPHC press release that goes out quite often within a few days, but I would also like to suggest that perhaps the US delegation might consider putting out their own press release or informational piece as soon as possible so that any questions that there may be out there amongst people who aren't present in particular, so that those questions can be answered, because I think there is, always going to be a little bit of confusion given that this is a new situation. So thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a good comment. Mr. Keith, online, did you say we had a commenter?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two comments online. The first was a question which I provided a brief answer to, but I think is best directed to the Commission, from Lainey Welch, who asks, could you provide a brief definition of half-down approach?
Ms. Benkin, sure, please.
And Mr. Chairman, since that was the foundation of the motion that I made, I'm happy to speak to that. So the half down in this situation that we were referencing was to set catch limits halfway between the 2017 catch limits that the Commission had adopted and the 2018 catch limits associated with an SPR 46.
Thank you. So the announcement that I have been assigned to, I'm sorry. One more online. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There is one more comment online from Phil Anderson, who says, please do not give up on reaching an agreement in 2018.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Ms. Benkin.
Mr. Chairman, there was one, I know I'd been asked to make sure that we had clarified where the catch limits ended up in 2A, 2C allocations to the charter, 2C, 3A allocations to the charter industry and the management measures associated with that. I understand those will be in the news release that goes out, but I thought we were also going to read them out, or was that our next step? If I hadn't interrupted you.
Thanks for reminding us. So, Mr. Keith, can you read those?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the hard work of the Secretariat and the agency staffs for putting this together while we've been talking. So, based on the U.S. suggested TCEYs for regulatory areas 2C and 3A, these are the resulting charter management measures derived from the recommendation from the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, which you have already noted. In area 2C, the TCEY you suggested was 6.34 million pounds, which results in a 0.81 million pound recreational allocation. And that produces charter halibut management measures, one fish daily limit, a reverse slot limit of less than or equal to 38 inches or greater than or equal to 80 inches, and no annual limit. In regulatory area 3A, the resulting charter, the TCEY of 12.54 million pounds results in a 1.79 million pound recreational allocation to the charter sector, and the management measures which result from the North Pacific Fishery Management Council's recommendation are a 2 fish daily bag limit, a maximum size limit of less than or equal to 28 inches on one fish, a 4 fish annual limit, Wednesdays closed all season, and 6 Tuesday closures between the 10th of July and the 14th of August, 2018, 1 trip per vessel per day, and 1 trip per charter halibut permit per day.
Thank you. Any further business? So Ms. Parker reminded me that Commissioner Alverson and Commissioner Benkin are appointed on appointments that end on March 31st, 2018, or until they are replaced by some other process. This morning, the Federal Register noted that the U.S. is soliciting nominations for those 2 seats. You can look up the details in the U.S. Federal Register, but it specifically notes that current commissioners are invited to reapply. So, of course, we spent enough time together that I hope they both reapply and I hope they're both successful. But that solicitation is open for the public. One of the seats needs to be a person resident in Alaska. The other seat is a person non-resident in the other person is not a resident of Alaska. Those nominations are going to be collected until February 28th. So that's a requirement that I had in this rollout, and I have no other comment on it. February 28th, so it's basically 6 weeks or something like that. Anything else? Mr. Ryall, would you have any closing comments?
Yes, thanks very much, Commissioner Balsiger. I only have a few comments, and they've really already been captured by a number of the public speakers that came up. That by Bruce Garby and Tom Marking, and also Mr. Commissioner Allison also made similar comments that we have collectively, and I meant everyone in this room and others have participated, have worked to manage this resource, and there's been a lot of good outcomes that have happened because of that work. I think we are faced with a challenging time in front of us, not setting aside the disagreements that you heard the 6 commissioners speak about today. But I think collectively we agree that the resource is facing an issue, a significant problem, and that we need to address it. And probably the work that we did here today is not enough. It falls short. And nonetheless, I do think there is goodwill on both sides, and that we need to find a solution. And as Phil Anderson said, don't give up on 2018 and try to find a solution, even though we have not arrived at one today.
Ms. Benkin, statement?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be really brief. I echo what I've heard from public comment and from the other commissioners. I think I just wanted to add to that my deep appreciation for the work of the Secretariat. The commission staff is incredible in their support of our work and their willingness to answer our questions and provide us information day and night as we need it. So great respect to them. I'm humbled and honored to be working with this group of people. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other commissioners wish to make a comment? I'm saving the last word for myself, so. Yeah, yes, and so that Dr. Wilson.
Thanks, Chair. I'll be quite brief. I just wanted to echo Linda's comments and thank the IPHC Secretariat staff who supported this meeting both in person and also from the office. There's a lot of work that goes in to providing you with the best possible scientific and other information available to assist you in making your decisions. While the Commission hasn't reached agreement on a number of key topics at this meeting, we do continue to offer our unlimited service to you to continue to support you in trying to reach agreement on, in particular, the catch limits. I think at this point, Chair, it would be unproductive for me to make particular comments on where we find ourselves, and other than to say that we will continue to work with the Commission to do exactly as I've indicated, and that is to provide you with the best scientific advice to manage the stock sustainably into the long term. And with that, the only other comment I'd make is on the report adoption itself, which I'll leave to you to indicate how you'd like that to be handled, Chair.
Thank you. So handling the report, let's do that first. So as I understand it, you will produce that report and email it to us, and we will spend no longer than 10 days. Mr. Ryall, was that your date? 10 days to go through and review it and have our comments back to you. On the U.S. side, we will get the State Department and our legal side involved in it, and us 3 commissioners will commit to having those comments back to you certainly within the 10-day time frame. Is that satisfactory? Okay, thank you. And then I actually had quite a long speech, but I find most of us completely inappropriate, so I'm just going to skip that and going to go to, as others have done, recognize the work that goes into this. You know, these weren't easy meetings for us, but I will confess to having spent nowhere near the amount of time personally that the entire staff has. You know, it includes the stock assessment group, and so we see Dr. Stewart and Dr. Webster and Dr. Hickey and others here, but I know that there's 30 other people that contribute to all of that. So thank you very much for that. The IT staff that has put this together, I don't know if the audience recognize, but on the first morning, we couldn't hear each other because of echoes. Well, that lasted for the first session. The IT staff was on top of it. All these meetings, I believe this is all our own equipment. So when we were done at the end of the day, they were moving stuff around. So I appreciate that. It's often gone unnoticed. In the agencies, you know, we had a couple of ADF and G people here. Scott Meyer has always been really good at saying he's only the guy that writes a paper and there's 35 other people that do it. And that's accurate. We have the same thing in DFO. We have the same thing in the National Marine Fisheries Service. The council people, Mr. Hull, I don't know if he's here. Yes, he is. He's here. Dave Witherell are here. They work hard, but they don't do all the work. And so there's an immense amount of effort that goes into putting this together. I think it's not less than that effort that goes into the people that participate in the conference board and the not PAB. So I appreciate that. That is not an easy thing to get done, and those people pay their own way down here. So that's a great amount of effort, and it's part of the reason that we try to adopt the ideas and principles that come through those bodies. Both of those bodies, in large, recommended and suggested steps from our current quotas down towards the quotas that should be put in place this year. We adopted that in principle, and I think that was a good plan. We didn't quite get there, and we're going to continue to work on it. I don't know how we're going to do that, but we're going to. Last of all, the commissioners. This morning was the worst meeting that we've had amongst the commissioners, and I just want to take this last word to say that none of that was directed personally towards any of the commissioners on either side. No matter what I said, I like all of them. And I hope we can continue to meet and go forward on this. I think there's some, again, the bottom line was both parties agreed on what we needed to do in terms of reductions. We couldn't agree on how to get it done. And so that's an awkward place. But I don't believe for a second that any of the commissioners did anything other than what they thought was best and what they were required to do by their own ideals as we tried to get to a solution. So thank you for all for that. And that's the end. Safe travel.